Welcome everybody to today's webinar on taking circular action. My name is Uta Hönemann and I'm a Senior Sustainability Advisor for South Pole. Today we will be talking about upcoming regulation and how to measure your plastic footprint. And we are really excited to have you all in this webinar, so thanks for joining us. And before we start, as always, a little reminder of today's housekeeping rules. As you might have seen already, we have two windows. You have the one window where you can see the speaker and the slides, and then you have another window. And in this other window, we have a question box. And here we would like to ask you to add all questions that you have, and we will go to your questions in the very end of this webinar, or otherwise we will come back to you after the webinar. And yeah, the session will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. And the aim of the approximately next 45 minutes is to support you in taking circular action. And to do so, our experts, which I will present in a second, will start with explaining why we need plastic action now by giving you an overview of the current regulatory landscape. Thereafter, we will explain what a plastic footprint is and how it can be measured. And after that, we are really happy to present a real-life example and explain how we at South Pole had Bentley Motors to take circular action and to take plastic stewardship. Really exciting. And last but not least, as I just mentioned, we will also go to your questions and our experts will do their best to answer you. And with me here today are some of South Pole's foremost experts on circular economy from all over Europe. So we have Irene Hofmeier, our practice lead for circular economy, as well as Nicole Schlemmer, a managing consultant within the practice, and Tim Schmitz, a business analyst. And before I now hand over to our experts, I just want to take a minute to briefly present South Pole. And I'm sure many of you already know a bit about South Pole, and indeed we have the pleasure of working with many of you. But I just want to take 1 minute, as I said, to give you a really brief overview. We are a profit-for-purpose company founded in 2006 in Switzerland, and we are in the business of fighting climate change. And we are doing so by developing own carbon projects and are one of the leading developers and have provided nearly 1,000 projects in as many as 550 countries. And we provide with that climate finance to reduce over a gigaton of CO2 emissions and to provide social benefits to less privileged communities who are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And in addition to that, we are also a global recognized advisor on climate action with an ever-growing consultancy offering. And so today we have a global diverse team of more than 1,000 experts all across the globe, working side by side with both companies, investors, and the public sector. And here you see our ecosystem, as we call it, of clients and partners and how huge it is. And it covers both non-profits, carbon project, leading businesses from all around the world and across all industries, as well as governments and financial institutions. And in our work, we use a 5-step process to ensure the delivery of our clients' long-term sustainability ambitions, for example, with regards to taking action on plastic. And understanding and taking action, so the first step of this journey, are also the focus of today's webinar. And with that being said, let's have a closer look at the regulatory landscape. So Tim, please take it over from here.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much, Uta, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone, from my side as well. In the next couple of minutes, I'll be presenting what the external drivers are that call for action and why it is crucial to create awareness around one's plastic packaging footprint and what the benefits are. First, let's start with the main reason why we do all of this. And it's basically plastic waste around the globe and lots of it from packaging. The source plastics itself, which we all know is not all bad. It has many positive properties. It's lightweight, flexible, hygienic, and it can extend products' shelf life to emit less emissions than its alternatives. However, as you can actively see on this GIF, is environmental impact is highly problematic. and its leakage into the environment is not only hurting ecosystems and animals, but also humans on our side as well. And there's a big economic impact of this waste in the environment. And since plastic was created in the 50s, around 8.5 gigatons of plastics have been produced. And the scary fact of this is that almost 91% of all plastic has never been recycled, or turning it around, only 9% has ever been recycled, which leads us to take an action and improving the system. And in the before we kick this off properly from our side, you can take a moment and think about why companies should measure their plastic packaging footprint. It's more just like to get the flows, to get the juices going right now, as we have on the following slide some first steps on why it is important. So there's some drivers like transparency, legislation, disclosure, risk management, and taking responsibility. All of those are very much forming a common theme on urging companies to take an action. And we have some thoughts on which ones of those are actually the most prominent ones. For us, those in focus are creating transparency through disclosure, and on the other hand, also caused by legislation. It basically means that you need to stay ahead of the legislative curve, maintain trust with stakeholders by granting that transparency, and by collecting data and disclosing that on the other side. And as we can see, transparency is becoming a must, because lots of companies have become under pressure in the recent times, and stakeholders have taken it up on themselves to actually ask and pressure their companies to deliver an answer to this one of the most prominent problems of our time. As we are talking in the next couple of slides about those three different themes. So as we highlighted, transparency, disclosure, and legislation. We have both a voluntary system going and a mandatory system from the governmental side. And as you can see on disclosure of plastics and circularity, there's CDP, the Al McArthur Foundation, which you might know if you already have taken action in that space, and CSRD, an upcoming regulatory disclosure system by the EU. And then on the other sides, we have European-based legislation and regulation, and the national packaging obligation schemes, which most companies are well aware of and are part of already. And diving into that content and not spending too much time on it, on the overview, CSRD, if you can go to the next slide, is one of the upcoming regulatory disclosure systems that everyone needs to be aware of. It is an amendment it's amending the non-financial reporting directive from 2014, which was considered to be insufficient in delivering what it was once promised, and unreliable and uncomparable, which is why the EU has decided to found a new disclosure scheme of non-financial information, such as environmental impacts, which is going to start in 2024. And it implies more transparency on actual impact and financing channel towards sustainable investments. And what's important here, or what you can expect to disclose, are, for example, on circularity, which has its own aspect and is hence related to the plastics impact, is policies, targets, and actions related to resource use and circularity, specific information on resource inflows, outflows, and waste, and the potential financial effects from resource use. So basically, it's companies need to disclose if they have taken action, if they have taken certain measurements, and that they need to prepare it. So we have on the one side already one impulse that is supposed to influence taking that plastic action. And on the voluntary counterpart is CDP, as you might know, the Carbon Disclosure Project, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's a global nonprofit that runs the disclosure system for companies and regions and states on environmental impacts, risks, and opportunities. And it aims to drive climate action and environmental sustainability by providing a platform for transparency and accountability. And from this year onwards, for those companies that are requested to disclose their water security information, there will be 9 plastics related questions. And when you see that, you can basically expect to disclose knowledge on your plastic activity, awareness on the risks that plastic poses on you, the environmental and health impacts of plastics, and the quantification. And this is the important bit, the quantification, and what many companies lack is actually having an idea what it means, as I already said, to measure your footprint. And one of the questions that perfectly highlights this is the 6th one in the questionnaire. They're published by now, and is to provide the total weight of plastic polymers that are sold and to indicate its raw material content, so the different parts that actually make up those materials. Going towards the actual obligations from a regulatory point of view from the EU, there's many guidances, directives, and legislative pieces that guide the disclosure of plastics and packaging. And here on the slide, we have just highlighted, we're basically highlighting 2 different ones that are most interesting. It's one, as you know, the Single-Use Plastics Directive, and targets those single-use plastic items that are most commonly found on beaches, such as cotton bud sticks, cutlery, plates, and straws, where it's already needed to be monitored and reported by companies to reduce in 2026 compared to the 2022 baseline. And several single-use plastic items are already under restricted and under risk to be restricted. On the other side, there's the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which sets targets for reuse and recycling, with an important target of all packaging to be recycled by 65% by 2025 and 70% by 2030. And why I've highlighted that is because what's upcoming is a revised Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which is supposed to increase the goals even more. The EU aims to reduce packaging waste by 15% per capita compared to 2018 by 2040, which is supposed to result in an overall reduction of 37% in waste. And to achieve that goal, companies will need to offer a percentage of products to be reusable or refillable packaging. And it will be actually interesting to see what rules such as mandatory recycled content you will actually implement for companies or other countries to meet that goal. But if anything, the starting point will be a proper baseline of knowing the plastic packaging footprint of your operations. And going to the more implemented regulatory side of things, there is already an implemented plastic tax, or a levy, as of now from the EU. It was introduced as a financial incentive for member states to increase recycling and recyclability by issuing an €800 levy per ton of non-recycled plastic packaging waste. And countries are actually recommended to pass this fee on. However, not many have done this yet. 3 prominent examples on the top, with 2 of them being part of the European Union, have actually started it, with Spain and Italy both issuing a fee of €450 per ton of non-reusable plastic containers. Spain has already started it this year. Italy has postponed it, started next year. And the UK, a little bit differently, basically puts a tax on plastic that contains less than 30% of recycled content from last year onwards. And currently, as of April this year, it's at £210 per ton. And if those taxes are not implemented yet or in the foreseeing future in other European countries, it is really important, if your company operates globally or at least Europe-wide, to be aware that there is different regulatory requirements depending on where your company is active. And lastly, to round this up, you're very well aware that there is national packaging obligations. If you can go back 1 slide, please. Where cost savings and greater efficiency and the lasting reputations will be influenced by actually taken actions. So usually, as the packaging obligation works, you have to disclose how much packaging waste or how much packaging you put into a country or into a market. And by lowering that as much as possible, you're not only being compliant with the regulatory system that supports this obligation, but you can also identify hotspots on where you can reduce even more, where you can use sustainable materials, and lay a founded roadmap to go ahead of that legislative curve. And with all of those different inputs of that, which drive the external demand for taking action, I will hand over to Irene to present on how to measure the plastic packaging footprint.
Thank you, Tim. So now that we have a good understanding as to what's happening in the legislative environment that is pushing us towards reporting and measuring our plastic usage, why is this important at the company level? So if we move to the next slide, we can think about this as part of a greater slew of corporate social responsibility and the need for corporate accountability on environmental action. This is a framework from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development on the business of climate recovery that we can also apply to the plastic space. What this framework pushes companies to do is how can they raise their ambition by setting targets, combine these in sequential accounting to be able to report on progress, and in an iterative manner implement changes across their value chain in order to reduce their environmental impact. So when we're talking about plastics accounting, here what we look to understand is to have an overall vision as to what is the type of plastics that are being used across the value chain, and how are they behaving at the end of their life cycle or their use phase and in the environment. When we talk about plastic action target setting, we're looking at the ambition. So what is the ambition that companies can set? In the carbon space, you might all be familiar with the science-based targets. Whilst there is not an equivalent for plastics, we can use that same model to set targets for plastic action. So these are targets that require timeframes and they require metrics. So they are directly articulated with the plastics accounting. Finally, we need a transition plan. So if we look at the bottom circle of this image, the transition plan is what determines action. How are we going to translate those targets that have been set into a transition plan at the company level? So we need to break these down into long-term transition and short-term transitions by identifying what are the types of plastics that could be addressed in the short term versus longer term changes that might require changes in the business model. So by looking at these four elements of this framework, if we look at the top two, plastics accounting and reporting and disclosure, that is where accountability lies. You need those two elements in order to demonstrate strong corporate action in addressing plastic pollution. These two can only operate if the other two are also part of a company's sphere of action. Just doing the accounting or just doing the reporting doesn't lead to increased ambition and action on addressing environmental issues at the corporate level. So what we are speaking about today is how can we, on one hand, take the actions at the company level to respond to the slew of legislative progress that is happening at the European level that Tim just outlined, and at the same time set up a system internally that allows to easily report on this progress, but also set in place targets and a transition plan that can iteratively feed back into both the accounting and reporting so as to showcase the progress that companies are doing. South Pole is particularly well placed in supporting both companies on their plastics accounting for their packaging use and on helping them set ambitious targets in order to implement their transition plans. If we move to the next slide, The way that we do this is through our plastic packaging solution. This is a solution where we, in an efficient manner, support companies in measuring their plastic usage for packaging and showcase what they can do. So the way that we do this is that we start with a kickoff workshop in order to understand what is the scope of the inventory. So what are all the plastic materials that are being used in packaging at the organizational level or for an individual product? And this can include everything from plastics associated to the packaging of the product itself to also the plastics involved in the logistics value chain, the plastic packaging involved in the logistics value chain. Then this is followed by a process of data collection. So once the inventory is complete and all the data has been collected, we can move to the next step of analysis. In this step, we characterize the types of plastics to understand what are the different plastic types that are being used, their composition, their volume, and their lifespan. This information is key in order to understand what are the potential environmental impacts of the plastic waste that is being generated from the packaging. In this analysis step, we also do a calculation. So this calculation involves standardized formulas that allow us to calculate the total plastic footprint for either a specific product or at the organizational level. This includes the amount of plastics used and the emissions generated during the production, transportation, and disposal. The end result is that you have an understanding of the portion of plastic waste that will end up as mismanaged and its end of life, and of that mismanaged waste, of that mismanaged plastic packaging waste, what could potentially leak into waterways. We finally report all this back in a nice PDF report. So if we move to the next slide, you can see that our plastics packaging solution is basically the analysis that I just described contained in a PDF report that contains a footprint hotspot. So a description of the end-of-life scenarios of the plastics that we can see also done at a regional scale, so showing how this occurs at the different markets where the product packaging is being disposed. Then the hotspot analysis is used to define what are the potential mitigation measures, so recommendations on those target setting and ambition planning that I was describing earlier. And then finally, how this can be achieved over time. So a roadmap that describes over the next 10 years, how can the mitigation measures be implemented and how this would impact the footprint hotspot. So in a summary, what we support you to is to measure your plastic packaging footprint in order to understand what plastic packaging might be potentially be lost to nature, in order to be able to reduce that loss and apply both short-term and long-term interventions in order to lessen the company's environmental impact. What companies benefit from is quick delivery. This is a solution that we can do within 4 weeks. It provides actionable insights. So it's not just an accounting exercise, it's an accounting exercise with tangible actions that the company can implement both in the short and the long term, and it's a straightforward process. So to describe how this has actually been done with a client, I will now pass it on to Nicole, who will share our experience of our packaging plastics accounting with Bentley.
Thank you, Irene, and hi everyone, welcome and thanks for joining. My name is Nicole and I will tell you a bit about a case study, a public client of ours that we work with in practice on this topic exactly, which is Bentley. You all might know Bentley as a luxury automotive producer. They're based in the UK, and in 2020 they have set a new sustainability strategy called Beyond 100, where they have set themselves the goal to become the most sustainable luxury automobile brand in the world. And this doesn't only mean looking at the carbon footprint, but really at the entire environmental impact that they have, including plastics. And they reached out to us to understand better their logistics, and they're manufacturing plastic packaging better and then act upon it. We love that. We loved working with Bentley. They were a great client, super kind, very high ambitions in terms of their carbon and environmental impact agenda. And they themselves were very proud of the project and what we have achieved together. And they have published a video that summarizes the project a bit and gives a bit of an insight into which types of plastics were included. As you might know, Bentley is not really a plastic associated brand. But as Irene mentioned before, there will be plastics in most companies, manufacturing and logistics processes. So we can just have a look at that video. It doesn't have a sound, but it has text, so it will all be clear in there, hopefully. Amazing. So I hope that gives a bit of a nice background. We really like that video. And if you go to the next slide, you can see here a bit of a small recap of what you just saw, is that no matter whether you actually sell plastic products, plastics are used in your operations and in your manufacturing as well. So here in Bentley's value chain of what kinds of materials we looked at, you can see, the parts that are coming from the suppliers are packed in packaging. Imagine like bubble wraps and these things to arrive safely at the Bentley manufacturing site. Then you have plastics in the manufacturing logistics as well. Think of shrink wraps, for instance, of pallets and these things. And then once the cars are done, they will be wrapped, there will be body, like seat covers, there will be steering wheel covers, there will be covers on the doors. That is all made of plastic in most cases as well. So that one is then shipped with the cars to the dealerships in globally, really. Bentley is selling to over 60 countries, I believe. And then sometimes there's also some after sale materials that are in the cars going from the dealerships to the consumers in all of these countries. And what we love is that Bentley also wanted to understand its impact of tire abrasion. So if you actually drive a car and the car tires are made of rubber, as the tire gets used up, it will release small particles of the tire itself, which are microplastics. So Bentley was also interested to understand what the impact is of all of these cars driving and releasing this microplastic into the environment directly. So looking at Bentley's case, there were 5 steps that they've taken to their plastic stewardship journey. They have achieved the so-called net zero plastic to nature label for 2021, which consisted of first the plastic footprint, as we've discussed it earlier today, but then also external action beyond their own value chain to invest in plastic waste collection infrastructure. And then they've communicated it with things like the video we just saw. So looking at the plastic footprint, the first 3 steps, what we've done here with Bentley was to first scope and understand which kinds of material do we want to include, which kinds of geographies, in this case it was just global, how exactly will we scope the plastic footprint? And then we collected all the data. So Bentley went back and collected the data that they could get and sent it over to us. For us to, in the second step here, to calculate the footprint, which includes the plastic volumes, like the total volumes, the composition of the plastics, but also, and this is something that many companies don't really have the insight into, depending on the country where you operate or where your plastic waste ends up, there's a different infrastructure for different plastic polymer types. So we can map and calculate how much of your plastic is going to recycling, how much is going to landfill, how much is going to incineration, but also how much is exported to countries where they probably will be leaking, especially looking at European countries. We export a lot of waste, and then what actually happens to that waste is never really clear and probably not very well managed. As well as if it's leaking directly in these countries, we can calculate all that and then see hotspots, whether that is geographical hotspots on a polymer type level, hotspots on a product type level or a packaging type level. So we can really map out your entire plastics value chain and say, this is what you should be focusing on, which is the third step here. We will then use the insight to give recommendations. Of course, the first step Bentley and any company has to do is to now go inwards and see what do I have control, or what do we have control over? What do we need to change in our own operations? So we told Bentley in terms of, high volumes, what they can do to decrease volumes. We've given them recommendations on different substitution of materials for certain types of packaging they're using. We told them which suppliers to engage that might be sending a not so good polymer type packaging to them that might have a higher likelihood of being leaked. So it's really, it can go in any way, but having that deep insight into what your plastics look like really helps to give very tailored and very detailed recommendations for you to act on. And that's what Bentley did. They really immediately took our recommendations. It was amazing to see, and then went on and engaged these suppliers and reduced as much as they can. And then what they also did, and what, no, if we stay on the slide. Yeah, as the fourth step is that they also then looked at the non-processed portion of their plastic waste. So of course, as you ship waste around the world in your cars and in your operations, there is oftentimes it will be impossible to take care of all the waste because the infrastructure is dependent on the countries. So what Bentley did was to look at how much of our plastic footprint volume is mismanaged currently, and then they took that volume and invested the same volume into 2 projects in Thailand and India that are collecting plastic waste from the environment. So in that case, Bentley mitigated the same volumes as they are seeing in their own footprint. And that's what called the net zero plastic to nature, which they've achieved for 2021. And then they publicly communicated about it. We worked with their communications department as well as our own to make sure the press releases were okay. And we worked a bit on the whole social media and outreach together with them to make sure that the right message comes across. Yeah, if we go to the next slide. And you might wonder what types of data those are that we would like to, or we need to collect to have this kind of footprint. When looking at a data collection sheet, I've made a couple of mock data, so these are not the actual Bentley data. You can see here how this looks like, what kinds of data are needed. So going from the left to the right, we first look at, as we saw before in the value chain, is this parts packaging, is this vehicle protection, what exactly, where does this specific packaging component fall into? We also need to know the destination country. So understanding if Bentley, for instance, produces their cars in the UK, but then sends it to more than 60 countries, what are the proportions and where is the waste ending up by how much in volume, basically. If this data is not available, then this can also be done using sales data, and then it can be extrapolated in that sense. Of course, the type of plastic is very important because that determines what the end of life fate will be. So a PET bottle is more likely to be recycled, or a PET material in general, than, for instance, a PVC or any other like a PS type of packaging. So that also is very important to understand. We also look at the packaging level. So is it primary, secondary, or tertiary packaging? Of course, the packaging name. Here you can see, for instance, a stretch film that is going to Belgium in this kind of volume is one row, and you want to have that really granular in that sense as much as possible. We split it by factory sometimes as well. Of course, if you have reusable packaging, that will be included in the whole equation, and how many uses this reusable packaging usually has. We also look at the recycled content, also if there's any bio-based content that will be considered. The packaging type to have that granularity and have enough ways to split it and look at the hotspots. And then of course the weight, which is really the determining factor here. Yeah, and looking at after the footprint that we've been able to do with Bentley, what have they achieved? And you saw some of this in the videos already. So Bentley really went internally and reduced the volumes of plastic packaging to a minimum. So you saw the parts protection for outbound products, so the cars that they're sending out, they reduced the items from 13 to 6. Then also some unnecessary items that they saw were not really, they were just there by default, but weren't really used. They could reduce 12 tons by that. Shrink wrap, they could reduce on site by 86%. And they also even looked at the pallet banding to use cardboard to wrap pallets and stabilize pallets instead of shrink wrap there. They also engage suppliers because they recognize that one of the greatest contributors to their plastic footprint are inbound logistics packaging. So all the parts that are coming in that are wrapped and are protected, mostly in plastic packaging. So they started working closely with their suppliers to reduce the packaging on these parts. And they also empowered and raised awareness with colleagues. So not just the teams that were then actively collecting data for the project, but also just across the company. The whole company seemed very excited, and they even had an internal video where they would show how things were done. And it just brought awareness to the entire operations so that also colleagues can effectively reuse and reduce packaging around site. Yeah, and this is just another quick quote. So Peter Bosch is one of the members of Bentley who was involved and sort of signed off the project. And here you can hear it from Bentley themselves, emphasizing how important this project was for Bentley to evaluate the impact of their packaging and reduce and recycle plastics used. And here you can see as well, Bentley not being a company you would usually associate with plastics. You can see here, we talk about bubble wrap, about foam, car body covers, shrink wraps, and so on. All of these were looked at, and then this insight was taken to take coherent action. But yeah, that's it on Bentley. We hope you have already, or if not already, left some questions in the chat box, and we can address them together. So handing back over to Uta.
Yes, thanks, Nicole, and also thanks to the other speakers. Really interesting. We have a couple of questions, but I think we can start with this one here for you, Tim. How much time do we have to prepare for the CDP plastic question? Is one of our listeners wondering.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So CDP, basically there's these, as I just briefly tapped on, there's 3 different types of sections that companies can be asked on. It's climate change, water security, and forestry. Overall, all of them have the same deadline, end of July in a reporting year, with the process, so basically the online tool opening up between March and April in the same year. So it started about a month ago, and now companies have time this year until end of July. However, as I mentioned, plastics this year is not scored, so it's more of a trial phase right now. And when it's scored from next year onwards, that means that companies have, from now that they're aware of that, time until May, April next year to gather that data. And then in order to use the period between March and April and July next year to put it all into the answer sheets. So roughly a year now time to actually collect that quantitative plastic packaging data.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and as we know, time flies by, so good to have you here in the call and great that we start to familiarize ourselves with this even more. We have another question from Amira El-Manadeli, and she's wondering what software or tool was used to calculate the plastic footprint? And I think that might be a good question for you, Irene.
Sure, I can speak, I think, to this question in two parts. So before speaking about the software, I also would like to highlight the methodologies that we use. So at South Pole, we use the best-in-class science available for plastics accounting. This is primarily two sources: the Plastic Leak Project, which is currently being reviewed under the Plastic Footprint Network that we are co-secretariat of, and the Guidelines for Plastic Corporate Stewardship. So these two pieces of work, they are, if you wish, the best-in-class guide for defining how to go about measuring plastic usage across the value chain and how to calculate the end of life. So the standardized formulas as I was speaking to earlier. And the aim with the Plastic Footprint Network that we are co-secretariat of is to establish the protocol, if you wish, for this plastics accounting work. So we're also widely involved in both that network, but also currently working with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development on corporate plastics accounting. So I mentioned this because I think it's important to highlight that our accounting work is backed by science. And when it comes to the software or tool, the way that we handle this process is through our own internal proprietary tool. So on the client-facing side, so on the company side, what we facilitate is a data collection template where we guide you, we tailor it to the type of company that you are, and we walk you through how to go about the data collection, and then that data that is collected by the client we input into our internal tool. So I hope that answers the question. I don't know, Nicole, if you would like to add anything regarding the experience in doing this with Bentley.
Yes, because that was actually another question that we got. The really concrete question: was it difficult to collect data for Bentley?
Yeah, hi, sorry, my connection here was a little off. It was Bentley's first time, so it wasn't the easiest exercise, I would say, especially because if plastic was not usually a focus for suppliers. Let's say if they're selling something to you, they don't usually have to put the polymer type on the invoice, let's say. So for Bentley, it was a very interesting exercise for them to find out what types of data are available. Sometimes that was not as granular as needed, so we did support there with some research on different material types and different products that they're using photographs, for instance, doing desk research, reaching out to suppliers as well. So filling the gaps through that. And Bentley could then use this insight for consecutive years to improve their data quality as well as to do things better in the coming years, and also tell their suppliers on what kinds of information to include, let's say, in their invoices and other data materials.
Really interesting. Thanks for sharing that with us. I have another question here that I would like to ask, and that's the one by, yeah, we'll take this one. Yes, from Marta Monet. So the question is, if you buy a product from another company that has already calculated and compensated its plastic footprint for that specific product that you are buying. Do you then, as the buying company, include that plastic footprint in your company's calculation? Irene, could you take this one?
Yes, I can. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. So if I'm a company that buys a product from another company that has already calculated and compensated its plastic footprint, okay, that's an important clarification. So we haven't spoken about compensation. I alluded to it when I was speaking about target setting and raising the ambition and implementing transition plans. So the compensation can look at, when we speak about compensation, I imagine that you're referring to the plastics that are unavoidable, mitigating it through investments outside of the value chain. So for that, it's important to remember that this is an accounting exercise that would need to have first occurred at the company that is the first step manufacturer. And for the buyer, they would need that proof of compensation. For the buyer, when they do their accounting exercise, the inflow doesn't change, so there's still that volume of plastic that the buyer needs to account for, but they will need that the evidence of compensation, so that when the calculation on the end of life, so the portion that has been compensated can be taken into account in that end of life calculation. I'm not sure if that's super clear. It's a bit complex because basically in the accounting exercise, when we do the end of life calculation, we show how much of the total plastic use is going to either landfill, recycling, or into nature. And the compensation portion is to compensate usually for the portion that might potentially end up into nature. So the impact of that compensation for the buyer is basically eliminates the need for that specific volume that has been compensated for the inflow into nature. I hope that was clear. In short, it does help the buyer for that portion of plastics. They would still need to do the full accounting exercise, and it won't allow for them to claim full compensation unless if that's the only product they're using, but that is highly unlikely. So I hope that was clear.
Thank you so much, Irene. Yeah, we have another question, so maybe you can also move our question or focus to the very first topic of this webinar, the changes in the regulatory landscape, but also with regard to standards. So we have a question here to you, Tim. Which kind of company will have to comply with CPPWD or SUPD? And do you also want to repeat for all of us what those acronyms stand for?
Yes, so the first one is the Plastic Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, and the second one is the Single-Use Plastic Directive. And basically, it's companies. So when they use that's a directive, legislation, or regulation, usually it's the member states being the target of that, not the company specifically. So in the end, these two are directives, meaning that they are not necessarily enforced by regulatory instruments. They are highly recommended and suggested to member states to follow, but they're not penalized if they're not following through by that. So in summary, this would affect companies in member states that take the action and basically put it into their own regulatory instruments. And then it will be all companies that are specified therein. Otherwise, let's say we just talk about the target companies, it would be all of them contributing to member states' markets. from my understanding.
Yeah, interesting. And as I guess we can summarize is that many things are likely to happen this year or next year based on.
I mean, so specifically the packaging and packaging waste directive is interesting as it's supposed to be review, or like there's supposed to be a revision. So that was in November last year. There was a statement from the EU that basically what I mentioned in the presentation, there's supposed to be certain changes to the targets being set, and also the suggestions or the instruments. So basically having, let's say, a required amount of recycled content in your packaging. But that's to be determined. That really depends on when that publication or revision takes place.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Just like checking if we have another question that we should and could answer here. Maybe here we have a really specific case, but I think that's an interesting one as well, maybe as well for you, Tim. So if we have a company that produces machines that then food producers are using to wrap their products in, so they are just producing the machine, they have not directly they're not directly producing the plastic. So does this company then, who enables other companies to produce plastic or to do single-use packaging, do they fall under this regulatory obligation to report their impact, or are they out of the scope of the initiatives?
No, it's a very good question. I think it's from when you're very embedded in that topic, it's always good to take a step back and to look at actually, you know, how everyone feels addressed with it. So I think that's also a clear, maybe a clear confusion on all these levels, because we talked about voluntary ones, we talked about mandatory ones, EU level, national level. So there's definitely distinction. Then it's not that straightforward. But it really, so the answer is always, it kind of depends. With regards to packaging obligations on a national level, I would say no, as most obligations focus on those companies that either produce, import, or sell materials or packaging in the market. So I wouldn't see a machine manufacturer having a responsibility there. EU-wide or CDP-wise, this could deviate, as with CSRD, I think, or CDP from a voluntary perspective, they would have to disclose their own basically packaging use and impact of their own operations and value chain, but it wouldn't include the packaging that the customer of who buys the machines would produce and emit. And with CSRD coming into force next year, it's basically all companies listed on EU markets except for very small micro companies. And those large companies need to fulfill two sets of criteria. For the first year, it's going to be more than 500 employees, whereas after that, so 2026 onwards, it's 250 employees, or have more than 40 million euros in turnover, or more than 20 million euros in total assets. Yeah, basically that would apply to all companies. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. And also thanks to everyone joining us today. It was really great to meet you and also to get so many questions and to be able to discuss the topic a little bit more with you. And now, yeah, just to wrap it up, we're going to share the recording with you tomorrow, the latest, and we are really happy to continue the discussion. And we really want to tell you to reach out to us if you have more questions or thoughts or maybe even projects. We are here to help you on the plastic journey and to take circular action. So enjoy the rest of the week, and yeah, hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.